I welcome you all to the module 2 of the course titled Foundations of Psychology, Concepts and Applications. So, the module 2 is about the biological basis of behavior. So, in this module we will be talking about how our biological systems influence the psychological aspects and or different aspects of the behavior. So, today is lecture number 3, and in today's lecture we will be focusing on the relationship between brain and behavior. So, there are 2 lectures under this module. This is the first lecture of this module. So, just to give you a brief recap of the last lecture, that is lecture number 2, which was part of module 1, and module 1 was about introducing the discipline of psychology, where we introduced, defined, and lecture 2 was about research methods and so on. So, in the last lecture we discussed the different aspect of research methods of psychology. So, there we discussed the key characteristics of the scientific method. What is the meaning of scientific method, what are the hallmarks of scientific method, and we discussed each of them in details. Then we also discussed the general steps that are followed in the scientific method. So, we discussed 4 steps that are generally followed in any scientific research. We also then discussed the different research methods used in psychology, such as descriptive research, correlation research, explanatory research and so on, and after that experimental research and so on. Then we also discussed what are the major approaches for data analysis that are used. Both focus was given on the quantitative data analysis, and at the end we discussed different ethical issues that one needs to be careful in doing research with human subjects particularly. So, these are the things that we discussed in the last lecture. So, today's lecture will be focusing on the biological basis of behavior. More specifically, we will be focusing on the relationship between brain and behavior. So, we will talk about the concept of nervous system and how it connects to human behavior. We will also talk about human brain and behavior. We will also look at certain aspects of the brain like lateralization of the brain, brain plasticity, and at the end we will discuss how endocrine system, which is also connected to the brain, and it also influences various aspects of the behavior. So, let us start today's lecture. Now, when we talk about the biological aspects of behavior, one of the curious case or one of the very discussed case that shows the impact of the biological aspects and the aspects of the brain and how it influences behavior is the case of Phineas Gage. So, it was an accident that happened with this person Phineas Gage, and which happened in 1848. He was a railroad construction worker. So, this is a tragic event where but it provided certain insights into the biological aspects of behavior. So, during a routine procedure which involved some explosive, an iron rod was propelled through the Gage's left cheek, skull and frontal cortex. So, an iron rod was propelled through the left cheek and then it came out through the skull. That was the accident. Now, this is a very serious accident, but miraculously the person survived. But one thing people noticed that the whole personality or the behavioral aspects of the person completely changed after this event, because there was some damage to the brain structures. So, this was the person, and this is how the rod was propelled through the cheek and through the skull. So, obviously, there was a damage to certain part of the brain. What transformation happened? So, before the accident, Gage was described as serious, industrious and responsible person, very serious, very responsible, very hardworking and so on. However, after the accident, he exhibited traits just opposite to what he was displaying before the accident. So, he became irresponsible, thoughtless of others, lacked planning and consideration for the consequences. So, just complete transformation of the personality, he became just an opposite person. So, this Gage case highlighted the critical role of the brain structures, particularly the frontal cortex, in regulating behavior and personality trait. Because there was certain damage to the certain part of the brain which was controlling certain aspects of the behavior, because of the damage, now no longer those behaviors were displayed by the person. So, this kind of showed that how certain structures in the brain are responsible for specific functioning and so on. So, we will look into some of the other details of the future research then exhibited the functions of various aspects of the brain. So, this biological basis of behavior is one of the key area in understanding psychology, because it shows that biological processes influences human actions. So, you cannot completely talk about human behavior, psychological aspects and thoughts and emotions without talking about the biology. So, there is always some biological connections and underpinning of various aspects of human behavior. To understand psychology, we need to have some basic understanding of the biological aspects and how it influences human behavior. So, that is the whole purpose of this module. So, this brain behavior relationship basically refers to how biological structures and processes of the brain and nervous system influence thoughts, emotion and actions. So, the brain and all the associated structures in the biology, they influence thoughts, emotions and actions. So, this is the area is a central area in biological psychology. So, when we talk about certain subdisciplines within psychology like biological psychology, neuropsychology, cognitive neuroscience, they typically look into lot of this biological underpinning of human behavior. So, the key assumption is all behavior has a biological basis to it. So, this whole area of biological or biopsychology explores the role of different aspects of biology like role of genetics, role of hormones, role of nervous system and brain, and how all this shapes human behavior. All these dimensions are looked into the biological psychology. Now, in this particular lecture, we will be focusing on a nervous system, brain and hormone, how it shapes human behavior, and the next lecture will focus on the genetics, because genetics requires a separate lecture because there are a lot of research involved in it. So, this lecture will focus on particularly the nervous system, brain and hormones and how they influence human behavior. So, let us look into the nervous system, which is the foundational aspects of our biological system and how it influences behavior. So, when you look at the nervous system, human nervous system has two main division. One is called as central nervous system, another is called as the peripheral nervous system. Broadly, this is how it is divided. Now, central nervous system, when we talk about, it includes brain and spinal cord, and all the remaining aspects of the nervous system are called peripheral nervous system. Now, in the central nervous system, nerve spreads outward to every part of the body from the central nervous system. So, brain and spinal cord, the nerve spreads out throughout the other part of the body and connects to the other part of the body, both internal and all the other, the movement oriented like hands, legs and so on. So, nerves goes out of the central nervous system to the different parts of the body, and they form, all this outward nerve forms the peripheral nervous system. So, once a nerve extends beyond the central nervous system, then it becomes part of peripheral nervous system. A simple way to distinguish the two systems is by their protective covering. Structure of the central nervous systems are enclosed within the bone and the nerves of the peripheral nervous systems are not. So, central nervous system like spinal cord and brain, this is enclosed within the protective structure like skull and certain protective system. Peripheral nervous system nerves are not generally protected by some external layer. So, if you look at this division, so we have a nervous system, then there is a central nervous system and then there is a peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system includes brain and spinal cord. So, these two structure forms the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system includes all the remaining nervous system, which is further divided into somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. So, what is somatic nervous system? Basically, it conducts nerve impulses from central nervous system to the skeletal muscles and it controls voluntary function. So, somatic nervous system includes all those nerves and nerves which controls voluntary function. For example, the movement of the hand, movement of the leg, I can control it. So, it is in my control, conscious control. So, these are all part of somatic nervous system, all the nerves which controls voluntary movements. Autonomic nervous system conducts nerve impulses from central nervous system to internal organs and glands. It controls involuntary functions. So, autonomic nervous system, which is also part of peripheral nervous system, it connects to all the internal organs and glands and we do not have control over it. So, it happens automatically with a certain, there is some kind of programming is already fixed and it functions accordingly. So, autonomic nervous system controls all the glands, like digestions, heart rate and so on. We do not have control over most of these functions. Okay? Therefore, autonomic nervous system is kind of automatic. So, therefore, the name comes here. Now, again autonomic nervous system has two further division. One is called as sympathetic nervous system and another is called parasympathetic nervous system. So, sympathetic nervous system activates body during emergency situation. So, sympathetic nervous system gives you extra energy whenever there is an emergency situation. For example, whenever you get afraid or there is a fear, there is a threat, your heartbeat increases, you start sweating and so on. So, this is done by the sympathetic nervous system. It is preparing you to fight with the situation or run away from the situation. So, sympathetic nervous system mobilizes body resources, gives you extra energy to fight with the situation or run away from the situation. Okay? So, this is called as fight or flight response. Parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. So, it cools the body. If you do not have parasympathetic nervous system, once you get activated, probably will never come back and become normal and cool. So, parasympathetic nervous system kind of conserves body resources and brings the body back to the normal functioning level, and it slows the heart rate and so on and so on. Okay? So, once emergency is over, the body comes back to the normal position, it heartbeat slows and so on. So, these are all controlled by parasympathetic nervous system. So, this is broadly how nervous system is divided and the different parts involved in it. This is just to show it diagrammatically. So, this is the brain, this is the spinal cord, and there is a protective layer if you see on the brain and on the spinal cord. So, these are central nervous system part. All the nerves that goes out from spine to the outward, from the brain to the different parts of the body, to the legs and so on, these are all forms as peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system may have somatic nervous system, which basically connects to the hands, legs and so on. Autonomic nervous system connects to internal glands and so on. So, those include sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So, this is like diagrammatic depiction of both the different systems of the nervous system. Now, let us specifically look into brain, because that is the most important part that controls all the functions, and that is where all the psychological functions reside. So, we will look into brain more elaborately in today's lecture. So, as we know, brain is very complex and it controls everything of our body, including thoughts, emotion, behaviors and so on. Brain has billions of neurons, trillions of connections, which allows us to perceive the world, memorize things, solve problems, feel emotion, interact with others. So, everything, the center of function is the brain, which has billions of neurons, nerve cells and trillions of connection within them, and that is why all these complex functionings becomes possible. So, understanding this relationship between the brain and human behavior is the central focus of particularly the biological psychology, neuroscience and related disciplines. Now, if you look at the brain, it is, if you see in terms of parts, sectionings, how it is like we can divide it into different parts just for the sake of understanding. The biologist divides brain into different parts. One is called hindbrain, midbrain and forebrain. These are just divided to understand the different functionings of the brain. So, hindbrain is the lowest part. So, if you see the brain, so the lowest part which connects to our spine. So, that is called the hindbrain. So, the lowest part of it. So, that is the hindbrain. Midbrain is just above hindbrain, somewhere it is a small structure in the almost in the mid or center of the brain. So, therefore, it is called as the midbrain, and all the remaining the cerebral structure that we see, the largest part is the forebrain. So, in one sense brain can be divided into hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, and they have different structures and different functions which we will look at. So, hindbrain is the lowest, oldest in evolutionary form, because all animals also have that. It controls lot of important functions, basic biological functions like breathing, controls breathing, heartbeat and so on. Midbrain is like somewhere in the mid, a very small structure. Forebrain is the most advanced evolutionarily, and because of the forebrain development, human beings are able to do lot of functions simply because of the evolution of forebrain. Now, let us look into each of these. So, when we say hindbrain, so it is located at the lower back part of the brain. So, this is the lower back, just above the spine. So, it connects the brain to the spinal cord and coordinates many vital functions such as breathing and heartbeat. Now, this is very important because it serves the most vital functions like breathing, heartbeat. These are most important functions, without that we cannot survive. So, if there is a damage to the hindbrain, your survival chances of survival is very less, because it will, your vital functions will stop. So, therefore, this part is very important. So, it controls all essential life support processes, breathing, heart rate. So, a lot of these reflexes, whenever you go touch a fire, your hand automatically moves back. So, this is also controls by hindbrain. So, for survival this is very important. So, it includes various structures. There are three main important structures within the hindbrain. One is called as medulla, one is called as pons, and another is called as cerebellum. Now, when we talk about medulla, it is closest to spinal cord, just connecting spinal cord is medulla, forms the core of the brain stem. We will look into the figure also. So, there is a brain stem like, there is a stem like structure that connects spine to the brain. So, this stem extends somewhere till the midbrain. So, this is the lowest part of that stem. It regulates vital functions like heartbeat, breathing and reflexes. So, most important function, this is done by this medulla part. Then comes pons. Just above medulla there is a small structure called pons. It carries information between spinal cord, lower brain to the forebrain, regulates sleep and wakefulness. Pons is responsible for sleep and wakefulness. We sleep, there is a cycle of sleep and we feel sleepy, we wake up. These are important functions that are controlled by this structure. Cerebellum, just behind the pons, controls balance, coordination, fine motor skills. It is because of the cerebellum we have a balance in our body. Without cerebellum, there will not be balance in the body. We will not be able to coordinate things, and all the voluntary movement that we do it very smoothly, voluntarily. We can walk smoothly, we can dance and so on. This is because of the cerebellum is able to maintain all this balance. So, these three structures are part of hindbrain. So, if you see the brain structure, so this is the brain stem, this is like stem of a plant. So, here it is the spinal cord, then this part is called cerebellum, this is called medulla. Just connecting spine is the medulla, above this is the pons and just behind it is cerebellum, and these three forms the hindbrain part of it. And this is very important because they control all the important functions: breathing, heart rate, sleep, wakefulness, reflexes and so on. So, this is like most vital functions are controlled by the hindbrain structures. Then comes midbrain. It is like a relay station which connects hindbrain with the forebrain, the largest part of the brain. It controls automatic movements of eye muscles, keeping focus stable when the head moves. So, a lot of this eye muscle movement, keeping focus stable and so on, all these are done by the midbrain part. The part of the brain stem, this is also a part of the brain stem. The midbrain is the topmost part of the brain stem. So, if you see this brain stem, so this is the stem, let us see. So, just above that is the midbrain, So, this also actually extends to the hindbrain and connects to the hindbrain to the other part of the brain. So, midbrain is a very small structure which typically has something called as, also it has some other structures, but most importantly it has reticular formation. This is not a particular structure, this is a network of neurons stretching from hindbrain, midbrain and forebrain. So, there is a network of nerves or neurons that connects all these things in the brain stem. So, it controls attention, alertness, arousal, filter sensory input, letting important information reach higher brain regions, ignoring irrelevant and so on. So, attention, alertness, all these things are controlled by that. So, if you see the midbrain where it is located in the structure. So, this is the brain stem. If you see above this, just top part of the brain stem is the midbrain. It is a very small structure here, and below it is the hindbrain. So, this is where the small structure is called as the midbrain, and all this remaining part is forebrain. So, this is just to show where the reticular formation is there. So, this is the brain stem part, and this whole network of nerve is called as reticular formation. The midbrain, pons, medulla, everything forms the brain stem part of it. Forebrain, which is the largest part, and we are able to do all these complex functionings and processing of information, solve problems and so on. It is because of the forebrain. So, this is the largest and most advanced part of the brain. So, it is located at the top front of the brain. So, all the top front part of the brain, it is responsible for all higher cognitive, emotional, sensory processing and so on. So, it has many structure, we will look into it in detail, because that is where all the psychological functioning is seated. So, key structures in the forebrain, one is thalamus. So, thalamus is just somewhere in the center of the brain, just above the midbrain. So, thalamus is the relay station for sensory information. Because of the thalamus, we are able to have sensory information like touch, vision, hearing, taste. Only smell part is not there in the thalamus. All the other sensory processings are done in the thalamus. It directs sensory signals to the correct part of the cerebral cortex. So, all the sensory information is processed by the thalamus, and then it relates to the different parts of the brain wherever it is required to be processed further. It helps regulate sleep and wakefulness also. Thalamus also works in that, works with the basal ganglia to control, also voluntary movement is also controlled by it. So, it has multiple functions. So, one part is thalamus, which is part of the forebrain. Second part is hypothalamus. As the name suggests, it is just below the thalamus, therefore, it is called as hypothalamus. So, this what is the function of hypothalamus? It is a very tiny pea-sized structure under the thalamus, very small structure. So, it regulates hunger, thirst, body temperature, stress response, reproductive process, daily rhythms, emotional aggressions and so on. It is a very small structure, but does so many functions. So, just imagine if this part gets damaged because of some accident, so many loss of function will happen. It connects to the endocrine system. All the lot of these glands that functions actually are controlled by hypothalamus. It triggers hormone release in various glands. So, it works as a lot of master of in terms of controlling functions of many other glands. It can switch on instinctive behaviors, like it can switch on behaviors such as feeding, mating, nurturing, aggression in response to certain stimulation. So, it is a very important function, very important organ, very small part, but does so many functions. This is very important structure. Then comes limbic system, which is also part of the forebrain structure. It typically controls all the emotions and some part of memory function also. We experience emotions because of limbic system. So, limbic system includes further structure like amygdala, hippocampus, parts of thalamus and hypothalamus. So, it is a kind of system of like combination of structures which forms a whole total system called limbic system. It includes amygdala, hippocampus, some part of thalamus and hypothalamus in this whole network of limbic system, and they all control various important functions, particularly emotions and memory functions. Thalamus, hypothalamus we have already discussed. Amygdala part, it triggers fear and other emotional responses to threats. Whenever you feel there is a threat in the environment or your life is in danger, you experience fear, particularly that fear is controlled by amygdala. If your amygdala gets damaged, you will not experience fear, you will not know whether there is a danger or I should avoid it or not. So, it is very important, it is very important for survival. Because of amygdala, we know where to go, where not to go, where there is a danger, where there is not danger. So, this helps, amygdala gives you appropriate emotional reaction, fear reaction to the situations. Hippocampus is crucial, the next part hippocampus, it is crucial for forming new memories. So, this kind of consolidates memory, forms new memories and so on. Without this, we will not be able to form lot of new memories. So, that is hippocampus. So, all these structures forms a network of structure called limbic system, and it plays very important role in our emotions and formation of memory and so on. So, this is if you see in the brain where it is located. So, this is like thalamus, which we have already discussed, below thalamus is the hypothalamus. Then there is a here full network, it includes amygdala here, hippocampus somewhere here. So, there is a kind of network of nerves that forms this one. So, this is somewhere very near to center of the brain, but they come under forebrain structure. Then the cerebral cortex, the outer layer, the most, whenever we see brain, we see cerebral cortex actually. So, which is visible from the outside. This is the top and outmost part of the forebrain. Now, this part is responsible for all the higher psychological processes like thinking, language, planning, problem solving, creativity, higher cognition and so on. So, this is evolutionary more recent and advanced. Because of this, as a human being we are able to do all the complex things. We can think very complex ways, we develop languages, we are able to plan ahead, we solve difficult problems, we are creative. All these are because of this sole cerebral cortex that developed in our brain. Now, we will talk about this cerebral cortex part in little bit more detail, because all the psychological functioning that we talk about are typically in the cerebral cortex part, how it connects to cerebral cortex. Now, let us see cerebral cortex in more detail. Now, cerebral cortex has further many part to it. So, this is the wrinkled outer layer that we see is the cerebral cortex. This is the largest part of the forebrain. All the other structures somewhere are in the seated somewhere inside the brain, but this is the outer largest layer. Now, if you look at cerebral cortex, there are two hemispheres in it. One is called right hemisphere, another is called left hemisphere, and these two hemispheres are connected by a bunch of nerves called as corpus callosum. So, there are two, if you see the brain, there is a connection, there is a two separate part, one is left part, right part, and they are connected by bunch of nerves. And this bunch of nerves are very like 1/8 inch of a thick, very small, but makes up to 80% of the this structure, and it also includes like wrinkles, increases surface areas to fit inside. So, if you see the cerebral cortex part, it has many wrinkles, because this wrinkles helps to increase the surface area, but then accommodate within the skull small area. So, such a large cerebral cortex can be accommodated in the small skull. So, it functions all the higher mental processes, thinking, problem solving, language, voluntary movement. We are able to speak, we know language because of this cerebral cortex only. We are able to think and we are able to process information, and all these are because of cerebral cortex. So, if you see cerebral cortex, then there are two hemispheres. So, if I just show you like this, there are two hemispheres. One is left hemisphere here and one is right hemisphere here. So, both have different functions. Now, each hemisphere, and they are connected by corpus callosum somewhere in between. Okay? Now, each hemisphere again is also divided into different sections. So, that is what we will be looking here. So, if you see each hemispheres, both left hemisphere and right hemispheres, they have different lobes. So, each hemisphere has 4 lobes. So, this same 4 lobes will be in the right hemisphere also, in the left hemisphere also. So, this is just mirror image, but these 4 lobes are both in the left hemisphere as well as right hemisphere. So, if you see there are 4 lobes, if you see back side, this part is called as occipital lobe, little above that is called as parietal lobe, and the front part of the brain cortex is called as frontal lobe. So, these 3 lobes and below there somewhere near our ear, above the ear is called as parietal lobe. Similarly, these 4 lobes will be there in that side also, right side also, left side also. So, these are like mirror images, same lobes will be this side, that side also. Now, each lobe has very important functions to play. So, these are all part of cortex only. So, occipital lobe, which is in the back side, this part occipital lobe, the back side of the cortex. Now, it processes visual information. It is because of this part we are able to see. Eye cannot function independently. Information from the eye goes to this occipital part, and that is why because of that processing in the occipital part we are able to recognize objects and faces. So, all the visual information that we get through eyes are processed in the occipital lobe. Any damage or blow to this occipital lobe will disrupt visual information. You may not see properly, so there may be blurriness and so on if there is a damage to this occipital lobe. So, this is typically functions in terms of processing visual information. Then comes parietal lobe. So, parietal lobe is just above, little above the back side. This part is called parietal lobe. What is its function? So, top side of the brain. It contains somatosensory cortex. It processes touch, pressure, temperature, pain and information from muscles, joints, where is the position of body awareness and so on. Okay. So, it also does a lot of this somatosensory system, touch, you understand there is a pressure in my certain part of the body, the temperature, pain and so on. These are typically controlled by, processed by parietal lobe area. Body parts are represented unevenly here, sensitive body parts areas like hands, face get larger brain regions. So, touch from the hand and face for example, have more areas in terms of processing, because major sense of somatosensory information comes from these areas. So, like different parts of the body are represented differently in the parietal lobe. Then comes frontal lobe just behind the forehead. So, this part, this is the main executive center. All the decision making, reasoning, planning, problem solving, self awareness, everything is processed here. It regulates also emotions, happiness, sadness, impulse control. It also contains motor cortex, controls voluntary movement of the body parts, similar to sensory cortex, somatosensory cortex. It also has mirror neurons which fires when performing or observing an actions. Because of the mirror neurons, we are able to copy someone else. If I see someone is doing some actions, I can also repeat that. It is because of this mirror neurons, which is found in the frontal lobes. So, it does all these higher cognitive processes because of that. Then comes temporal lobe, which is just above the ear part, this part, both sides, one temporal lobe here, one temporal lobe here. It processes auditory information. So, occipital lobe processes visual information, whatever we get through eyes. Temporal lobe processes whatever we hear, auditory information, hearing. So, just ear cannot does the function, because ear relays the information whatever we hear and it goes to the temporal lobe where it is processed, then we know what have we heard and so on. This is important for also speech comprehension and memory functions. We are able to understand a lot of the speech when we hear someone speaking, this processing happens in the temporal lobe. Now, there are also something called as an association areas in the cortex part, which are like chain or network of neurons which connects everything. So, they also are responsible for higher mental tasks like language, thinking, problem solving, connecting sensory input, creative. So, these are not just isolated areas, these are all also connected by association areas, So, this is not localized in one area, but the network of interconnected neurons spread across the lobe. All these lobes are also interconnected among each other. So, there is a like complete coordinated functions that happens. So, these are not isolated functions. Obviously, they are specialized in something, but they all also coordinate among each other, which is done by association areas. Now, our brain has specific language areas in the cortex, because of which we are able to learn language, we are able to understand language. So, there are two particular areas which are responsible. One is called as Broca's area. This is left frontal lobe. So, left side of the hemisphere. So, there is a two hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. So, left hemisphere in the frontal lobe, this part is found. This is called as Broca's area. So, this is called Broca's area because it was discovered by Paul Broca through study of a patient nicknamed 10, who could understand speech, but could not produce meaningful words. So, this was a case study of a person from which he discovered this area. So, this person could understand the speech of someone else, but he could not produce any meaningful words. So, Broca found that there was some problem in this particular area of the brain. Broca found degeneration in the egg-shaped area of the patient's left frontal lobe, which is called as a Broca's area, and this region is now called as Broca's area, and it is essential for speech production. If this area is damaged, you will not be able to speak. You may understand, but you will not be able to speak. So, this is somewhere here, Broca's area, frontal lobe, left frontal lobe, left side of the brain. So, there is a small area called as Broca's area. It is because of this area we are able to speak. If there is a damage here, we will not be able to speak. So, this is one area called Broca's area, responsible for speech production. There is another area which is not in the frontal lobe, but in the temporal lobe. Both the areas are in the left hemisphere. This is left temporal lobe. So, there is an area called as Wernicke's area, because it was identified by Karl Wernicke. It is responsible for language comprehension. It is because of this area that we are able to understand someone else's speech, comprehension of the language. Broca's area is for production of language, speaking. You are able to speak because of Broca's area. Now, you are able to understand speech because of Wernicke's area. So, this is as we have already shown, Wernicke's area is somewhere here in the temporal lobe. What is the connection between them? Broca's area and Wernicke's area are linked by nerve fibers, enabling interconnection between them. So, these two areas are also connected. Because of that, we are able to produce speech, understand someone's speech and then produce speech. So, they are also interconnected. So, brain is, all the areas are always interconnected. So, this is a coordinated holistic function that happens. So, damage to either area or the connection fibers also create problem, which may lead to something called as aphasia, which means impairment of speech production or comprehension. So, if there is any problem in the speech related issues, if there is a damage in any of this area or connection between these two areas, there will be issues in the language production, understanding and so on. Now, brain, so these are different parts of the brains and there are different functions of each brains and there is also coordinated functions. It is not just isolated functions. So, we have understood specific areas which are responsible for this. Now, there is another concept in the brain is called lateralization of the brain. As we have already discussed, there are two hemispheres. So, there are two parts, they are separated but connected. So, this is the division of function between left and right hemisphere. So, there are two hemispheres in the brain. If you open the skull, you will see there is a division and there are two sides in the cortex or in the brain itself. So, there is a two part and they are connected to each other. One is called left hemisphere because it is in the left side. For most people, left hemisphere, as a hemisphere there is a separate specialized function, dominant function, not just only function, but this is dominant function. For most people, left hemisphere is responsible for language abilities. As we have seen, both the language areas are in the left hemisphere, frontal lobe, left frontal lobe and left parietal lobe. So, both the language areas are in the left hemisphere. So, left hemisphere is dominant for language abilities for most of the people, for some it may be different. So, speaking, reading, writing, also specialization for logic, problem solving and math. So, left hemisphere has major functions in it, dominant functions. So, it is not that other part does not do any of these things, but dominantly left hemisphere does this function for most of the people. So, all the language functions are in the left hemisphere, your logical ability, you think rationally, you are able to solve mathematics, you solve problems, all these are more dominantly functions are in the left hemisphere. Right hemisphere for most of the people is dominant for non-verbal processes, non-language related things like spatial reasoning, like you visualize things, maps, puzzles, face recognition, gesture, emotion interpretation, music, art, creativity, all these are connected, which are not directly connected to the language, are mostly in the right part, right hemisphere part of the brain. So, if you see, brain is, if you open the skull, the brain looks like this, but they will be also interconnected, there will be corpus callosum which connects both the hemisphere. So, left hemisphere typically language, analytical thinking, mathematics and so on. Right hemisphere spatial awareness, creativity, music and so on are typically in the right part of the hemisphere. So, this is called lateralization. So, there is a division of lever. There are two parts and they does different functions dominantly, not exclusively only done by this, but dominant functions. Now, this integration of hemisphere also happens despite there is a differences in their function and specialization. People are not simply, you cannot say they are left brain, right brain, although these words are used. Most people are dominant, language is dominant in the left and creativity, visualization is dominant in the right brain. Brain generally functions, there is an integrated way brain functions, although there is a specialization. So, brain function mostly overlap across hemispheres and rapid communication occurs via corpus callosum. So, there is an always integrated function, although some specialized area will do something more specifically, but then always there is a coordination. So, both hemisphere generally share work on most tasks, they will share and kind of coordinate all the functions. Now, this lateralization is also related to handedness. Some people are right handed, some people are left handed, that is also connected to lateralizations. So, language dominance is linked to also handedness. Handedness means whether you are right handed or left handed, dominant, which hand is your dominant hand. 95% of the right handers, most of the people are right handed because their dominant hand is right hand, and among them 95% of them, for them left hemisphere is language dominant. For them, for 95% of the right hander, which is most of the people, their left hemisphere will be dominant for language related functions. So, that is the general statistics. 70% of the left handers, like people who are dominant in the left handers, not 100%, but 75% of them will have left hemisphere dominance in terms of language. 15% of left handers, right hemisphere dominance will be there in terms of functions. Another 15% mixed dominance. So, there can be like mixed people, but typically people who are right handed, their left hemisphere is dominant for language, and people who are other people are kind of mixed, and certain part there is not very clear cut percentages and so on. Now, there is another concept called as a brain plasticity. Now, what does that mean? This is also very important. Our human brain is very dynamic. It is not a static thing like it is doing whatever function is given to certain part and it is doing that all the time. There is a sense of plasticity, means brain also changes its functionings, its place of function and so on, depending on the need of the situations. So, plasticity of the brain means the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself after injury, trauma or developmental changes. Brain keeps evolving, brain keeps changing, it reorganizes its functions, it adapts. So, if there is an injury, brain will try to adapt, and whatever function has been lost, it will try, other part of the brain will start taking over that. So, it kind of reorganizes itself to the best of its ability, so that you can function in a better way. So, that is called the plasticity of the brain. It is not very fixed and rigid, it evolves, it changes, it is a dynamic process. So, in some cases healthy neurons can take over functions of lost due to damage. In some cases, if there is a damage in certain part of the brain, other part of the brain can take over those functions. Now, this can also happen. So, that shows the brain has a dynamic aspects to it, it tries to adapt. Now, there are such evidences available also of plasticity. In several epilepsy neurological cases, one hemisphere may need surgically removed. Such cases were there where whole hemisphere was removed surgically because of certain epilepsy or neurological problems. Whole hemisphere was removed. So, just imagine half of the brain is already removed. In those cases, so people do not die because of that, especially when it is done in the earlier age, before the age of 13, patients many times functions normally even after the removal of one hemisphere. Why? Because other hemisphere takes over all the other function. Especially this happens when in the younger age. For example, if the left hemisphere, which is dominant for language, is removed, the right hemisphere can reorganize and develop language function, because language function for most of the people is in the left hemisphere. Now, let us say because of certain neurological issues, left hemisphere is removed, right hemisphere actually can take over all the functions like language functions also, especially if it is done in the younger age. So, this is the is an extreme examples of brain plasticity. Human brain can adapt to that extent also. In case of stroke and injury recovery also, after damage another part of the brain may take over lost function. Many times because of stroke certain part of the brain function gets damaged, and many times other part actually takes over after some time. Physicians are exploring stimulation of healthy neurons to make them compensate for damage. Physicians are trying to find out how to make this compensation easier and faster by stimulating other neurons and so on. So, that is also in the medical field it is going on. However, there are limits to plasticity. It is not that brain any part will take over any function. So, there is a limit to that also. So, plasticity is greatest in young children whose brains are not yet fully lateralized, because full lateralization happens once you become adults and so on. So, in the younger age brain is still more evolving, more dynamic, there is specialization is less localized. In that cases, one part can take over the function of another part much more easily and quickly. The precise mechanisms obviously is still not very clear. There is a limit exists, the brain can reorganize to some degree, but cannot fully compensate for extensive damage. If there is a very extensive damage, brain may not be able to fully function the way it was functioning before that. Some functions may be taken over, but it may not be full takeover in many cases. Although there is a plasticity, but there is a limit, because that part of the brain is damaged. Now, other part can take over, but it may not take fully, the functions may not be fully developed and so on. So, there is a limit to that also. Now, let us come to the endocrine system. So, this was all about brain and different parts and how it connects to different psychological functions and so on. Now, endocrine systems are basically includes all the glands in our body, which releases hormones in the blood, and those hormones influences us. So, these are also important biological aspects of our body that influences your psychology. So, unlike the nervous system which communicates via electrical signals, nerve system communicates via electrical signals, endocrine system or the glands in our body communicates via releasing hormones in the bloodstream. So, in the nerves communication happens through electrical signals. In the endocrine system or the glands, they communicate by releasing hormones in the blood, which goes into different parts and they communicate with each other. So, this is communication happens through hormones. Hormones act like neurotransmitters, but travel via blood. So, these are like neurotransmitters, but they travel through blood and connects to the different parts of the body. So, these hormones acts on distant cells in a more widespread and coordinated fashions. So, this endocrine system works closely with the nervous system and is specially regulated by hypothalamus. So, there is a nervous system is you cannot remove nervous system. So, these hormones are also connected to nervous system, particularly the hypothalamus controls the release of lot of this. Hypothalamus in the brain controls lot of this secretions of hormones by the other glands, and they have their accordingly influence. The different hormones have different influence in our psychological system. So, most of these hormones does lot of functions like regulates physiological arousal in the body, metabolism, growth, sexual functions, and everything is controlled by lot of these hormones. Let us look into some of the major glands and what is their functions. We will not be able to go too much deep into it, but let us see what are the major glands and what are their functions. The first is hypothalamus. It is not actually typical in the gland, but it controls a lot of these glands. As we have already discussed, hypothalamus is in the brain only, but it controls a lot of these other glands in terms of how they function. So, it is not typically a gland, but it controls a lot of these glands. It is a part of brain and the forebrain structure. So, this is a brain structure controls pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is the master gland. It controls all the other gland, and hypothalamus controls this master gland. So, this is how the chain of command happens. For example, hypothalamus will release this releasing factor. These are called releasing factors, like these are like chemicals when they are released, like these are growth related releasing factors, like this will stimulate growth in the body. Hypothalamus will release this, it will trigger pituitary gland, which is the master gland, to release growth hormones, which will ultimately stimulate physical growth. So, like this. So, hypothalamus will first give the command to the pituitary gland, and this pituitary gland will then further give command to other glands, and they will release either directly pituitary gland will release some hormones, or they will command other glands to release hormones, and different hormones have different functions. For example, for physical growth, pituitary gland directly releases certain hormones which stimulates growth and so on. So, hypothalamus can stimulate or suppress pituitary gland. So, it controls pituitary gland. Either it can command pituitary gland to release something, or it can command do not release anything. So, it can inhibit or it can suppress also. So, pituitary gland controls all the other gland, and pituitary gland is controlled by hypothalamus. So, next comes pituitary gland. As we have already discussed, this is the master gland, because it controls all the other glands. This is located just above the root of the mouth. So, somewhere in the brain, somewhere in the middle of the brain, and it is regulated by hypothalamus, directly it controls it. So, direct pituitary hormones means pituitary gland directly releases certain hormones also and indirectly also controls other hormones. It directly releases certain hormones like oxytocin, which stimulates breastfeeding, social bonding, cooperation, trust, recognition of emotions, stress, resilience. It has so many functions. Pituitary glands directly releases them. Once they releases, all these functions are stimulated. Another hormone is called vasopressin, which also directly released by pituitary. It regulates fluid balance linked to social behavior. It also releases growth hormones, stimulates growth and regulation. Many people abuse this illegally by some athletes, where they artificially try to stimulate them for certain growth, muscles of the growth and so on, and so on. Certain artificially people can stimulate that and so on. So, but there is a natural process to that also. Okay. So, these are like hormones directly released by pituitary gland, and indirectly pituitary gland controls all the other glands and all the other hormones. So, indirectly pituitary hormones can regulate all the other glands like ovaries, testes, thyroid, adrenal glands and so on. It controls sex hormones, triggers puberty, maintains fertility and so on. So, like everything is under its control. It is a very small gland, but controls so many things. Hypothalamus is also very small and it controls the pituitary gland. All these are very small structures and the functions are immense. Then comes pineal gland. This gland is particularly responsible for releasing something called as melatonin. It regulates sleep wake cycle. If there is a problem in this gland, you will not be able to sleep properly. So, whenever there is a disturbance in sleep, it is something to do with the melatonin, which is released by the pineal gland. Melatonin generally breaks down in the presence of light. Artificial night light may negatively impact it and so on. Okay? So, too much of imbalance in terms of, so sunlight is required for functioning properly, this melatonin. Some people take melatonin supplements to just cure jet lag, though it is not still very officially approved medication and so on. So, melatonin is something that is required for balance of sleep and waking cycles and so on. If there is a problem in that, the whole sleep cycle will get disturbed. Then there are many other glands and there are many functions, just briefly I will touch upon them. So, thyroid gland, which is somewhere in our throat, it regulates metabolism, energy use, life sustaining chemical processes by thyroid hormones. It releases thyroid hormones, which regulates metabolism in the body. Low thyroid activity can mimic depressive symptoms also, if there is a low thyroid activity and so on. So, thyroid function is very important. If there is a problem in the thyroid gland, there may be problem in the metabolism, and it can also influence emotions and so on. Then comes adrenal gland. This is the gland which is just above the kidney, and they are responsible for all the stress hormones. Whenever we get highly stressed in our life, this hormones gives you extra energy and so on to fight with the situation. So, stress experience is connected to adrenal glands. That is why people use the word adrenal rush if they want to do something very challenging, or let us say somebody want to go very fast and speed and so on. These are connected with the adrenal rush word, because this is connected to adrenal gland. So, regulated by pituitary gland, because pituitary is the master gland, it releases cortisol and other stress hormones, which activates the body and brain and gives you extra energy to deal with the situation and so on. So, stress reactions are controlled by adrenal glands. Then pancreas produces insulin and other hormones essential for digestion and blood sugar regulation. So, diabetes is connected with the problem in the insulin release from the pancreas. So, there is a problem in the functionings of the pancreas and its release of insulin. So, that is what then it is through medication it is controlled and so on. Ovaries in the females, testes in the males, they are also glands which releases hormones. They release sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone is typically in the males. It is regulated by pituitary input. So, all the sexual functions are controlled by these glands and so on. So, integration of the nervous system. So, nervous system and endocrine system, they operate together, they control each other, and like there is a coordinated function among them. The brain uses autonomic nervous system to regulate glands. Brain also has hypothalamus, which also controls the functionings of all the other glands and so on. For example, during stress, sympathetic nervous system orders adrenal medulla to release these hormones and prepares body for fight and flight situation and so on. So, there is a coordination also among nervous system and the hormonal systems and the gland system of our body. They all coordinate each other to bring about all the functions. So, these are some of the things about how brain and hormones are connected to our psychological functionings and other vital functionings. Next lecture we will talk about how genetics is responsible for various psychological functions. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.